Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Half Pint Sessions. My name's David, and before Jonathan Rumi, there was Dorothy L. Sayers, and before The Chosen, there was The Man Born to Be King by Dorothy L. Sayers. It was a series of plays, radio plays, and it was also C.S. Lewis's devotional reading every Holy Week. And this was actually something that I tried to adopt last year. But it turns out either Lewis was a far quicker reader than I was, or he had far more free time. So I didn't get through all of the plays during Holy Week. So this year, I will be starting reading The Man Born to Be King right after this interview. But to help us understand why this work is important and what is so great about this new edition that's just been released from the Wade Center, I have the editor, Kathryn Wehr. Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, David. Glad to be here.
Well, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey and your background with Sayers?
Yeah, sure. Well, I am here in Minnesota. I work at the University of St. Thomas as the managing editor of the Logos Journal. And so I did my PhD on Sayers at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And that was a nice mix of several things. My first degree was in theater, and then I did work in theology. And so being able to bring those two things together in The Man Born to Be King was a very exciting project. And when I first started looking at it, there just hadn't been much scholarship done specifically on the plays themselves. So there was a wonderful opening for me to look at things like how she used the Gospels, how she develops her theology, her themes, that kind of thing. So there was a lot to discover, and this new edition, which we'll talk about, is a great way to kind of actually make that research useful to people.
Now, I know a little bit about Dorothy L. Sayers, primarily from the Wade Center podcast. People who know me know that I have a drinking game that I can't drink, and my cup of tea, I might add. I can't drink my morning cup of tea until Crystal Downing has mentioned Dorothy L. Sayers. Fortunately, it doesn't take very long in each episode, usually like 5 minutes. We're usually good to go. But would you mind just filling in a little bit of the background of this woman who is regarded by some people as almost an inkling?
Right. Yeah, she's often studied with them because she has similar influences, particularly G.K. Chesterton. And her dates are 1893 to 1957. So she lived, roughly the same time, through both world wars, just like the Inklings. But she also got to know several of the Inklings during her lifetime. So Charles Williams was the first one that she met, and then eventually Lewis. And it was particularly through work on a book about Charles Williams after he passed away that Sayers and Lewis got to know each other very well. And then there are just hundreds of wonderful letters between them from the 40s and 50s. It's clear they really enjoyed each other's wit, but also intellect. They talked about their books that they were writing. And so but also lots of little jokes, and Sayers wrote little comics, and she wrote a whole letter to him in the style of Screwtape Letters about what was going on in her own life. So it's lots of fun. So I really recommend those letters to people.
And she was a very versatile author. She wrote mystery novels. I
Yep.
just started that. And this is hilarious. Are Women Human? I read it to my wife over breakfast a few months ago. But yeah, she seemed to do everything. She was quintessentially an inkling in style in terms of just writing in so many different formats and genres, but with a very, very recognizable style, and in particular, as you've mentioned, wit throughout all of her work.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, she and Lewis maybe had slightly, paths of writing that went like this. She started as a more popular author, but then by the end of her life, she was doing her most academic work, working on Dante, doing a whole new translation, but also lots of essays and, speeches and stuff about Dante. So that kind of thing. But she wrote plays. Obviously, we're talking about these, but also stage plays, plays for big festivals at cathedrals. Those were a big a big thing in the 40s and 50s. And so, I mean, I love it because it's sort of, it makes me think as a middle-aged person, like, oh, there's still time to take on a new genre. I can still teach myself medieval Italian. I mean, maybe I couldn't. Sayers could. She did, and kind of branched out into a whole new way of researching and working. But I love that about her. There's so much to discover.
Hmm. And it's one of the reasons that I love Lewis. It
Hmm.
depends entirely on what kind of mood I'm in as to what kind of work that I'm reading, but I can guarantee it can still always be a Lewis book.
Yes.
But let's talk about this book. We'll talk actually about the content first, and then we'll talk about
Okay.
what makes this so special a little bit
Yeah.
afterwards. So, The Man Born to be King. Where did this idea come from? What's it about? How is it received? Because I know that was a bit contentious. Much like The Chosen today, there are some people that
Right.
don't like certain styles of portrayal and art.
Uh-huh.
And if you will, a little bit about Lewis's own love of this work.
Sure. So, The Man Born to be King is a series of 12 radio plays. Sayers had written one radio nativity play in 1938 for the BBC, and that was very well received. And so then they commissioned her to write this series of plays. But when she was asked, she had very specific things in mind. It was not a given that Jesus could be a character. In fact, it hadn't been tried on the radio before. And that's because of some blasphemy laws that were in place from the time of the Reformation. And so just before World War I, that law was relaxed, and there could actually be a portrayal of Jesus on stage, but they still actually needed permission from the Lord Chamberlain of the government in order for that to be possible. And so it hadn't been tried in radio, but radio is a little more like what they were doing on stage, which would be like a voice off stage as the voice of Jesus. But they still actually asked permission, which is telling that they knew it would be a big deal. So she wanted Jesus to be a character. That was one of her givens. She wanted the characters to speak everyday English. She didn't want to just adapt her script from the King James, for instance. She used regional accents from around the UK because she really wanted her listeners to know that these were real, regular people that encountered Jesus. They weren't just kind of stained glass figures that were just straw men that were sort of allowing Jesus to do his thing or perform his miracle. They were like real people with real problems who had different encounters with him and had reasons why they either liked him or didn't like him or whatever, followed him or didn't follow him. And so those things she requested of the BBC at the time, which she agreed to do them. But as you say, it was controversial for that very reason. Some people thought it was blasphemous to have any actor portray Jesus, and particularly in words that weren't directly from Scripture. So you had a big protest from the Lord's Day Observance Society that had a big letter writing campaign. I've been to the BBC archives, and there's just whole folders of letters of people saying, "Please don't let these plays get on the air. God will be displeased." I mean, it was right in the middle of the war too, so people were very concerned and thinking. Some people felt like God would punish Britain because of something like this happening, and one even accused the BBC of causing the fall of Singapore because these plays were on the air.
The BBC is responsible for an awful lot. The fall of Singapore, I don't think, is one of them.
Right. Well, that's your opinion, right? Someone else had theirs. It was a big deal, but a lot of the controversy happened before they were on the air. But once people actually heard them, then the overwhelming response was that people really loved and appreciated them. They felt like they encountered Christ in a new way. They, thought deeply about different things. There's wonderful letters like of one, elementary age teacher who said, "I had children coming to me bringing their Bibles saying, where can I find this story that I just heard yesterday on the radio?" So it's wonderful. It had a really wonderful lasting effect. They were replayed on the BBC every year for many years. And then they were re-recorded in think it was it 49 or 50? And then they were redone again in 1964. Those recordings actually are available right now on Audible. So I recommend those. They're fun. They are shortened versions of the plays. Um,
Ah.
oh, there they are. That's right. So they're slightly shortened. They tend to take out the longer, more theological speeches, which I think, oh, what a shame. They take out the beautiful long speech of the Virgin Mary as Christ is carrying his cross, for instance, which Sayers, it's a really beautiful speech where Mary says, God is the truth, but I am the fact, but Christ, Jesus, is truth and fact. And you can't understand the fact or can understand the truth until it is enfleshed in fact. So it's sort of like the Nicene Creed in using theological language. So a beautiful speech like that maybe they thought people, would get lost in it or something, but it's beautiful. And so that's one of the treasures of having the written scripts. Sayers, when she published them in 1943, was able to put back everything that she wanted in her plays that had been cut for time mostly.
Well, let's transition and talk about the new edition that has come out from the Wade Center. Anyone that's listened to our podcast knows that I love annotated editions because I would get really irritated when people take old books and change the language and simplify it and shorten it.
Yes.
I think that's a waste of time. Give me the original, but give me a little bit of help. And that's what you have here. As you can see, there are little notes along the side, as well as some other introductory and supportive material. So would you mind telling us, where did this edition come from? What can people find in it?
Yeah, well, thanks. When I started my PhD, I wished, as I was rereading them, I often asked myself, now, which gospel is this story from? And so it's kind of like the edition that I wished existed when I started. So I felt like, oh, somebody should do this for the sake of readers everywhere, to be able to look and to do just what that teacher said the children were wanting. Now, where is that story? And so I was able to track that. I mean, there was a long process in my studies where I was then able to look at exactly how much content she used from each of the gospels. I have, academic article about that if people are interested. But here in the footnotes, you can look down and see not only is this, primarily a scene based on John 6, but she also pulls in material from Matthew or an Old Testament reference. So a lot of her, particularly like the members of the Sanhedrin, they quote the Old Testament all the time. So there's lots of stuff outside of the Gospels, but primarily, how is she using the Gospels? Sometimes she will pull details from different parts of the synoptics, for instance, but focus, it's mostly Luke, but with details borrowed from Matthew and that kind of thing. So that is there. Those are the footnotes. And then the side notes are all the other goodies that I found in the course of my research. So I looked at all of her letters related to the plays. So back and forth with James Welch, who's the head of religious broadcasting at the BBC. They have very wonderful, deep letters about the content. So why she's portraying different people this way, for instance, why she chooses to do a composite Mary Magdalene of Mary Magdalene, Mary Bethany, the sinful woman of Luke 7, which is something that a lot of readers, I mean, the first time I read it as a master's student, I was like, well, why did she do that? Everybody knows those are different women. But at the time, it was very traditional. And, so she actually discusses that. She's like, I know that, some biblical scholars are saying they're different people. But, church tradition has often said they were the same. So I'd rather be in good company with Augustine. So, you don't have to like her choice, but at least you know that she wasn't just like, oh, oops, I got those mixed up. So that kind of thing is there. And then she has a bunch of sources that she used, some commentaries and other biblical adaptations. And so links there, sometimes there are quotes that you think, oh, maybe she was inspired by that, or they did something very similar. So it's fun to have that material there. And then also her manuscripts. Occasionally there's interesting parts where she wrestled with a word or something. And so I looked at her handwritten manuscript where she's crossed it out and wrote something else. So that kind of stuff is there. for people. And you can dig into it as much as you want or find useful. But you're right. That's the thing, not to necessarily change the text itself or shorten it or make it palatable necessarily for today's readers. There are sometimes where she makes things that are like, ooh, we would consider that racist today. So we're not condoning that, but I take time to explain it. Like, this is what she was thinking. This seems offensive to us today, but at the time, it's not necessarily surprising.
Mm. And you mentioned James Welch there, and I
Yeah.
hadn't realized that those two were in contact, because he was the guy that got Lewis also on the air in what ultimately became Mere Christianity.
Right. And do you know, maybe you do know, but that's partly thanks to Sayers, because she did a series on the Nicene Creed a couple years before that. And she was the first lay person and the first woman to speak on a religious subject, wasn't a clergy person. And that went well. And so then they asked other lay people, including C.S. Lewis. So his series became Mere Christianity.
Yeah. I would like you just to speak to a moment, something. I'd just like you to speak for a moment to something which is kind of crazy to us today, speaking about different times. Sayers went to Oxford, but she didn't graduate initially. What happened?
That's right. Well, so at the time, Oxford wasn't granting degrees to women. There were women's colleges where women, lived, they studied, they took the exact same lectures, the same exams as the young men, but they didn't receive academic credit. It was just noted that they completed their studies. And so Sayers left Oxford in 1915 without a degree. But in 1920, Oxford decided to begin actually granting degrees to women. So she returned at that time and received her honors MA in 1920. But I mean, Cambridge was like 1950 something. So it was like, ooh, progressive, how progressive of Oxford. But it's kind of amazing to think that was still, I don't know when the first women's college opened at Oxford, but at least 30, 40, maybe 50 years of women doing the exact same work as men, taking the same exams. There'd be these lists that were public of like who got what place in the different exams, who got the highest score, but the women just didn't get the degree.
No piece of paper for you.
No.
Do you have any particular favorite sections of The Man Born to be King?
Oh, I do. So many. I think perhaps my favorite, I mentioned that speech by the Virgin Mary on the way to the cross is definitely a favorite. I love play 5, particularly because it shows, that's called The Bread of Heaven. It shows the disciples really at work with Jesus, like how Jesus actually commissioned them, gave them the ability to heal in his name and to preach the gospel. So it just gives you an idea of what that actually felt like in a way that I hadn't considered before myself. I love the resurrection play. There's a scene in the upper room when Jesus comes through the locked door just after the two have returned from Emmaus. That is one of my favorite scenes for sure. Because partly because of the Emmaus part, Sayers takes a stab at thinking, what are the things that Jesus actually told these two at, you're so slow to understand what the scripture says. And then Luke tells us and he said from the beginning of the scriptures to the end, what was said about the Messiah, but we don't know what those things were. So Sayers lists, it's like 50 things that they're saying, oh, and he said this, and oh, and about that, and about this, and this, and this. And so it's sort of like, oh, the list we've always wanted. She at least makes a stab at it. I really think it's intriguing. This is one of these little more, what's the word, kind of, controversial
Dicey.
things.
Mm-hmm.
Like in The Chosen, there are things that people are like, I don't like how they're doing that at all. But how she uses a totally made up character named Baruch in order to bring along the storyline of Judas. So Baruch is a zealot character, which is also important because the scriptures don't really tell us what the zealots did or believed. So she uses external sources and then this character Baruch to show that dynamic of what was happening in you know, society at the time. And so, but he early on gets to know Judas, and then he becomes someone who's seeing Jesus as like, we could use a man like this in our movement, and if only I could just sort of get a hold of him, I could use him for my own purposes. So he's sort of trying to use Judas that way to get to Jesus, but he also has a way of really unsettling Judas, because Baruch is like this man of action, whereas Judas is like an intellectual. He's actually the disciple that seems to really grasp what Jesus is saying about suffering and death and the need for the Messiah to die, whereas the other disciples are kind of confused about what Jesus means. But because of this interaction with Judas, he begins to kind of distrust Jesus. He begins to be worried that Jesus has sort of his own idea that he's not telling the disciples. So Judas tends to trust his own instinct and understanding, and that is his downfall. And so, I mean, but I think it's a really interesting dramatic choice. And so Sayers, being an intellectual herself, having Judas as a more intellectual character, not someone who, just purely, betrayed Jesus for money, but that he thought he was doing the right thing. He trusted his own idea of what the Messiah should do, and he was trying to like help Jesus, do what he knew in his best moments that he needed to happen. But in the end, is his betrayer. So I just think that's a fascinating part of this. That's good food for thought.
And that is the controversial issue with both this, The Chosen, and pretty much any portrayal of the gospel. It's when the scriptwriter, when the author puts in either their own ideas whole or has a different take on a particular scene that departs from, I would say, the more traditional narrative. I think the example of the two thieves on the cross, that's a good example. I'll leave it to people to get the book and read it. But that's not how I've typically understood it. And I don't think it even needs to necessarily be right. But I think that phrase that you use there, food for thought, gives you an opportunity to really think over the texts and the scenes that we have mentally seen or seen on the TV or at the cinema, to really chew over the gospel in a new way, to sort of shock us out of something that we know very well. Another example I would give is, say, the Message Bible. A lot of the translation parts of it I don't really like. Some of it I think is great. But I would say its chief strength is that when I read a passage, it presents the text in a very different way that causes me to stop and think about the text that I know so well, and just to think about it anew.
Yeah, absolutely. And this certainly has been that for many people. And it's exciting. It has been in and out of print ever since 1943, because it's been pretty popular. And so now, 80 years on, this new edition is able to hopefully bring a new revival of interest in the plays. And I think they do make a really interesting comparison to The Chosen. I was speaking to a student group at my university a couple of nights ago, and that's how I presented it. Like, this is The Chosen of the 1940s. And I got them reading some scenes aloud, and it was kind of fun, because that's the part of it. It brings it to life.
Well, listeners, viewers, if you would like to pick up a copy of this book, you can actually read along with myself and Andrew, because he and I recorded our common room yesterday, talking about Lent. And one of the things that we didn't actually get to was some more of our Lenten disciplines. And we're both going to be reading this book. And so we'll inevitably be talking about it at some point. But Kathryn, can you tell people where they can pick up a copy of the book, and also where they can find out more about you?
Yes, you bet. So as you mentioned, this is from IVP Academic. So you can go to the IVP website. I assume you have show notes somewhere, so you can put that link. And it also, you can find it on Amazon or, some other book distributors, that kind of thing too. But right from IVP is great. I also have a website, and I have a link to IVP on it. So my website is just katherinewehr.com. And I'm sure you'll have the link too. I have a funny spelling of my last name.
It'll appear at the bottom of the screen.
But that from there, you can also, I have links to, for instance, my academic articles about Sayers, and which are, mostly my PhD chapters that I've published that way. And then other writings. I also am a musician, and I have my most recent album called And All the Marys, which takes different women in the Gospels and has a song about each of them. And those are actually directly related to my research on Sayers, because I wrote that album while working on my PhD.
Because you weren't busy enough.
Yeah. Well, it was, sometimes you need something to balance. I needed something that was like not at a computer screen. And I have some older albums as well. So it's not like it was just out of the blue. But it was a wonderful way to think actually deeply about some of the things I was writing about. And I don't know, spend some time with these wonderful women that we have in the Gospels who are wonderful examples of following Christ. So anyway, that's me. You can find those there. And of course, the Logos Journal, my day job. It's subtitle is with Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture. And it's very interdisciplinary. So there's lots of wonderful conversations going on there. And yeah, you can look that up as well.
And I'll also put a link in the show notes to the presentation you gave at the Wade Center recently, talking about this book.
Yeah. Yes, that was fun. And I should say the Wade, you probably, mention the Wade Center regularly on your things, but it is a wonderful place for all things Sayers, as well as Lewis, and the other Inklings, and G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald. There's 7 authors. And it's just it's a wonderful place to be. They have great events. But even if you live further afield, it's worth a visit just to see some of the amazing things they have in their archives.
My wife and I are planning a trip from La Crosse to, I'm calling it Inklings Disneyland, to the Wade Center, hopefully sometime this summer before we have our baby.
Oh, great. Enjoy that.
Well, everyone, please join us again next time. Thank you for Kathryn, and we'll continue going next time, further up and further in. Cheers.